Cluster bombs, landmines, untripped IEDs and EFPs. This vet's disarmed them all, but can't dispose of the lone live shell in a chamber of the Ruger 38, tucked into a sock in her backpack, prepped for her to check out. Out in all weather at 16th and Chestnut, cross-legged on cardboard, circled by her tools, sketchbook, markers, yellow number twos, sharpened to a lethal point. She can't stop being a sapper, mapping her minefield, diffusing, refusing the war. Disarm, a poem from a collection titled Beyond Repair. And this is a collection of tonight's guest, J.C. Todd. So, J.C.'s most recent book of poetry, which I just mentioned, Beyond Repair, uh, got a special selection for the Able Muse Book Award. And her other work, Damages of the Morning, was a 2019 Eric Hoffer Award finalist. JC was a winner of a Poetry Society of UK Award and the Rita Dove Prize in Poetry. JC has received fellowships from the Pew Center for the Arts and Heritage, Pennsylvania Council on the Arts, and residencies and programs, including the Bemis Center. Her poems and interviews have appeared in the American Poetry Review, Meso, Kamen, the Night Heron Barks, Paris Review, and the Virginia Quarterly Review. And of course, JC lives in Philadelphia. So welcome, JC. It's great to have you. I'm really eagerly looking forward to discussing this book, which I really think is a remarkable work of poetry. I really say, some books of poetry, you say it's a great book of poetry, but I think this is a necessary collection of poems that people have to read, really. It really, some books of poetry, you can say that there were lovely poems, but there are books of poems that really change your perspective on things. And for me, and I'll talk about that later, really had that kind of effect in changing my perspective on some things that is related to women in war. So anyway, we just wanted to open our discussion here and referencing an interview that you gave several years ago and to the Tree of Life review. And you were asked the question about your inspiration for writing your poems. And you quoted a line from Lucille Clifton, and quote unquote, poems are about questions. So I would just like to pose to you, when we're looking at this latest work, Beyond Repair, what questions provoke you to create this collection of poems?
Charles, I'm really delighted to be here. I'm looking forward to talking with you about this book. And the book really tracks my own transitions and evolution in my thoughts, my attitudes, and where my heart is with regard to war and to people who are in war, meaning living in war zones, either as civilians or combatants, residents or invaders. So thank you very much for having me here. Lucille Clifton had such a profound impact on me and hundreds of thousands, I think, of American poets.
Right.
She posed that question. Well, she posed that question many times in essays and conversations. The first time I heard her pose it was at a Dodge festival in the woods of New Jersey. And that her concern about questions being at the center of the poem, as being the propellant for the voice of the poem, has just stayed with me down these many years. It was probably 20 years, 25 maybe years ago that I heard her say that.
Hmm. Um, in the collection, you open the book with a poem, which really is a recollection of your birthing of your daughter. And when one sees the unfolding of the book, I guess there's the question of what prompted you to use this birthing image as a précis or preface poem in a way to the rest of this collection. I want to also say one of the geniuses of this, you end the book with a small line at the end of the poem that relates back in a way to the first poem.
Well, it's a book about women and war. You can't talk about women without talking about birth. It's just not possible. Uh, the the uterus is an essential part of the human female body, and so the concerns about birth are always wrapped up in concerns about war, and in political ways too. Because if you conquer a nation, all those new births now belong to you. So that's another layer of it. This book, I don't think, really discusses that layer, but it's there. The other thing is, I didn't want to write a book that was all despair. It seemed unfair. People live through war. Yes, there's despair. It's awful, it's horrible, and it's tragic. But on the other hand, they resume their lives as they can. And birth is part of that. I could say they are reborn, but I think that makes it too pretty. It's not pretty at all. But birth is part of it. I want to say one of the questions that drove this book, and it relates to this, I'm a civilian. I have not lived in a war zone, or at least not a zone where war has been officially declared. I've always lived fairly safely and with some degree of privilege in the United States of America. And so, what is my stake in this? You know, the poet just can't be an observer. It's too distant. It's cold. The poet has to have a stake in what they're writing for the poem to be authentic and for them not to misappropriate information that they're putting in the poem or data. So to close the distance between my witness, grounded in this relatively privileged life, and the chaos and upheaval of what I'm witnessing, I go to the birth of my daughter because now I have given birth and am protecting a person. And what are the wars she has been born into that we don't know about yet?
Mm-hmm. You have divided the book up into different sections, and you have very artfully created just a small intro. Like for this last section, it reads, "You are born into war by the war you are born into." In other places in the books, your treatment, the detail that you're able to present. For example, that whole section that deals with the wounded warriors and those that the medical staff are trying to rescue from death are really described in really great detail. So I'm really wondering how you came to get this deep knowledge of some of the experiences and the observations of what is happening with these people who are wounded on the field of battle in the struggle to keep them alive. And so, could you discuss that?
Well, I can come at that from 2 points of view. First, let me say that my husband is an emergency room physician, retired now. My daughter-in-law is a critical care pulmonologist, and she's practicing. My son was a corpsman, which is a medic in the Navy, and then became an EMT. And I can think of many times when I was carving the Thanksgiving turkey, and they were talking about these horrific scenes that they had witnessed in great medical and graphic detail. So medical conversation has been sort of part of the milieu that I am in. I don't do it well, but I'm not shy about it because I've lived with it for so long. So that made me comfortable. The other thing is that I did an enormous amount of research for this book. And if a person wants to reads the book, they'll see in the acknowledgments pages of resources that I used because I wanted to be as authentic and accurate as I could. Also, I was in every poem in this book, particularly in revision, I was looking to, let me back up a bit. Sylvia Plath wrote that a poem begins in a glimpse. And I was looking for the glimpses that would become a common ground for the reader to share with these horrific situations that war leads to. And I didn't want just a glimpse. I wanted a glimpse that also showed my mixed emotions. I'm a pacifist and I'm writing about war. I didn't want to hold back. I wanted to be fully present in the poems, at least my awareness. And at the same time, I wanted the clarity of the image to allow the reader to take in the horror of war.
Well, I really think in that respect, you have really succeeded. Because when I read that one section, it's almost like I feel that you're omniscient, but you're really right there in some of those situations. And there's a great deal of confidence in the way you created these poems. That it's not from you don't feel it's from the eyes of a poet or someone that is non-medical, but you are really kind of sharing the passion and the horror and what people are experiencing inside, in those very small moments, just on the thread between life and death, and trying to save these soldiers, and also I guess also a good feeling about why you're there when those that were on that thread do make it to the other side. So I think you really accomplished that. And I don't think you overdid it. I mean, a section like that, you could create a whole book of poems about just that one thing. And perhaps there have been books of poems, but I think you give enough of a treatment of that that goes along with so much of the other parts of the book. And which really brings me to the one section that really, when I say I think is important to read and how it changed my perspective, is your poems on PTSD. And I say that because me, popularly, or when I hear it, what is the first thing I think of? I think of a male soldier who has returned, from war, from combat, who's suffering from this disorder. They call it a disorder. we don't think of those women who have been in combat or proximate to combat, or in, as you know, corps men, corps women, or medical people who are all in the atmosphere of these horrible wars. And so it really opened my eyes to say, yes, we forget that there are women that are suffering from, this same thing. But from reading your poems, it's like, so much with women. It's almost like, well, I got to suck it up and go on because I have
Yeah.
kids to take care of. Like that one poem when you're talking about, you open it with the experience of war being lived out, but she's on her way to daycare.
Yeah.
She's on her way to taking the child to daycare. I found really, a very profound poem in getting that point across.
I have a couple of things to say about PTSD, but since you brought that poem up, maybe I'll read it because it kind of shows how I want these poems to go out into the world. So the poem is called Sweep, and sweep is when a military person is driving, is the driver in a military vehicle. They are always sweeping the roadside because the roadside is dangerous. And in fact, that motion of the eye flick, 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 flick is patterned then into the behavior of the person. And many people who come back continue to do that. Not the way you look to the passenger side, you look to the driver's side at a corner or going down the road or as someone passing you, but this almost metronomic sweep, sweep, sweep. So anyway, I'll read this poem.
Great.
Sweep. All dust and thunder, she says. The approach a ground cloud dervishing above its length for the dash through a village. MRAPs and Humvees, gunners at the ready. Kids peppering the roadside, flattened against walls of courtyards and homes. Commotion draws them, the din of a convoy, drivers keyed up, stopping for nothing. Even when the suck of speed and weight sweeps a stick-thin boy across the windshield or under the wheels. She is still scanning the roadside for trouble in her used SUV, driving to the daycare, the strip mall, the chemical air of the dry cleaners. After the first, she says, every time you go out, you know.
Wow, that is really, that poem really resonated with me. It really stuck in with me, and I remember it so well.
Thank you.
And there is all this about war, the PTSD, but there's also these little vignettes that you present in your own lived experience in your family of your uncles and that had gone off to war and had returned. And it's like what I got out of it. This is the innocence, the only you see a little bit of it, and as a child.
That's right.
I have to say, my father was a First World War veteran, decorated with a Silver Star and a Purple Heart. But he would never talk to me about the war as much as I would question it. And I never found anything out until a cousin of mine wrote a history of his tour of duty in France at that time. And he was dead by the time I read that. But these little vignettes that you have, I really think are very successful in that part of us. That when we were children, we looked up to these people that had served and had fought in war. So could you speak to that?
Well, in part, it has to do with my birth during the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
And so, although I was born in Brooklyn, New York, I lived on Long Island. It was relatively safe there. There were Nazi subs apparently patrolling the Long Island coast, but nothing happened. So I was born in December of 43. So that means by September of 43, fetally, my ears had developed and I could hear sound. And what was the sound I heard? I heard the radio. I heard my parents talking. I heard my aunts and uncles talking at picnics and, dinner. And they all were talking about the war because my father's 4 brothers were overseas. My father wasn't. He had a fiscal situation that he couldn't serve. But at night after work, for 4 or 5 hours, maybe 4 or 5 nights a week, he would walk the beach looking for Nazi subs, go home and sleep an hour or 2, get up, take the train to New York and work. And so it was just present in me. Was I aware of it? Who knows? But the thing is, that early brain is really patterned to what comes into it. Mm-hmm. And in my case, my brain did not shed those early things. Uh-huh. As we get older, our brain sheds what it doesn't need. But apparently my brain always needed this awareness of war and its outcomes. I was going to say, and its destructions, but it's not just destruction, it's all the outcomes. Mm-hmm. But then there's something else. In 2002, between 2002 and 2012, one of my sons, one of my daughter-in-laws, and one of my grandsons was in the Middle East, either in Iraq or Afghanistan, all of them in dangerous situations. And so then, like you with your father, I had questions. What was their daily life like? What were they doing? What was being done to them, or what were their circumstances? Mm-hmm. And I got, of course, no answers. Mm-hmm. I can say partly I got no answers because they were busy. They weren't chatting about it to me. But the other thing is they weren't going to talk about it. Right. And so it was something urgent in my sense of motherhood that made me begin to read military blogs so I could read about other people's daily lives. And then that began a continuation of a long history of reading fiction about Second World War, the occupation of Japan, Hiroshima. And then from that, I went into social histories of how does war affect people who lived through war. And then I began to read about Syrian refugees. And there's a big literature on that because the government of Syria has been bombing its people since 1982. So there's 40 years of refugees.
One of the things, and just as you talk about the difference, is a recognition, and maybe people don't realize this with poets, but poets are researchers, big time. When that, as you call it, when the question comes up, okay, it's not just, well, I'm going to kind of imagine it all, and I'm going to create an imaginary poem. Oh, yeah, there's that creativity. But poets really go deep in the research in creating poems, not just for validity, but to build language, vocabulary in a poem. And I really see this in your work. Well, you just express it, but it's throughout. The terms and the languages that you reference. So. That's a great inspiration, I think, to other artists is understand this is pretty hard work when you set out to do something like this. It's It's just not, oh, well, I jot down a few things every day. I mean, it is the process of research also. It is that probing. It's something that I mentioned in a couple of my last interviews about that much of poetry proceeds from ignorance, something that you don't know anything about, and you have a hunger to know about. And so you see that, not that you're ignorant, but you see that you have a necessity to have authenticity in your work, but it doesn't betray the beauty of the language.
Well, no, it doesn't, because the beauty of the language and the music of the language is where the poet is expressing what they hold in their flesh, right? Not in their mind, in their flesh. That is where heart, maybe we call it heart, comes from, or passion comes from. And also it is what allows all this data that goes into poems to be authentic, not to be a misappropriation of information, but to really, if the poet pays attention to how they position the poem, to really be an honest evocation of a situation that is very close to what we might call truth. You mentioned the poems about my childhood, and it occurs to me that there's a poem in here that might relate to this. Here I'm writing about myself, but I'm writing about myself as an 8-year-old in a blue dress that my mother made for me with little red piping, when my cousin Larry, who was a paratrooper, returned from the Korean conflict. He'd been injured in a jump, and so he was sent to Okinawa to heal. And when he came home with the woman who had been his nurse and was now his bride. Right. She was Japanese. She was the enemy of my cousin's uncle, right? Because Japan was part of the Axis during the Second World War. Well, of course, I didn't know the history, but I knew, I could feel like something was really weird. And I remember some of what I put in this poem, and I made up, invented other things that I think line up. It's called War Bride. Shall I read it now?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. And my cousin's wife's name, who she is my cousin now by marriage, is Hiroko. War Bride. Hiroko. I remember her from a ruffle of puzzlement in Uncle Harry's gruff voice when he whispered to my father, "Ah, Larry, what a wild one, marrying the enemy from our old war." Enemy? The delicate Hiroko, black clouds of her silky hair coiffed to stillness like mother's noble sable hat, a shimmery spirit glossed by gas log light. She was a mystery, silent and bowing in the dining room arch. Behind her, cut lace. On the table, guest dishes and the good silver plate, the best of what we were, America, laid for a feast where she would be not welcomed exactly, but looked at, examined. It was too late to worry if she would do. She'd accepted a Catholic Christ to wed her man. Real religious zeal, Uncle needled during dinner. Hiroko ate little. "Cut it out, Pop," Larry said. "She might catch on." After the blood rare roast and the satin whipped potatoes, appended to her husband's hand, topaz face, gold kimono, like a don't get it dirty doll that Larry bought from Okinawa. She was put on display for the men in the parlor. while the women wielded household clout, cleaning up the kitchen and shaking out their tongues. Mother God, marriage eternal is too good for a heathen, clucked Aunt Kate, who, though foreign-born in County Cork, had been baptized at birth in the one true church. But Aunt Bessie, whose son had given her a second daughter, sighed, fretful about the hips hidden under embroidered dragons. Would they widen enough to deliver the child of a 6-footer? What if they didn't? Could Doc Klein save them both? Don't count those 9 months too carefully, she bragged. Then shoot us little kids whining for root beer. Go be nice to your new cousin, Larry's bride.
Wow. So, I mean, we're really at that point in our broadcast where I would just like you to continue to read your poems for our audience. It's nice to always talk about, some of the things that go on, but people ultimately want to hear you read your poem. So the stage is yours.
Well, thank you so much.
By the way, I want to tell you, JC, I was born in December 1943 also.
Aha, we should celebrate together. Let's make a plan.
Okay, great.
So Larry was saying that Beyond Repair has a prologue, an epilogue, and then 5 sections. And each of the sections begins with a little, a couplet about war and its effects. But I want to start with the second section, which is a sonnet sequence. I won't read it all. A sonnet sequence, but also it's flash fiction. And the figure in it is a critical care doctor in the Air Force, a female, who is taking care of wounded in Iraq. It is based somewhat on a story or two that my daughter-in-law did tell me. That's where she served. But they are not her stories. I can't take her stories. They're yours. So they're pretty much based on research. So here she is. You're kind of in her mind. And she's referred to as she. So she's on a plane flying to Germany, transporting a severely injured airman to a trauma 1 level American hospital in Germany. This one's the airman who's got to come through the flight alive, cocooned in twilight sleep, a patient pumped with meds designed to keep the range of organ function within a value defined as viable for transport. True, she has been trained to follow orders that overleap good medicine, good sense, but not to sweep aside her oath to heal. On ground, she knew that prepping him was packaging a lie. 1 less war zone body count, a fake out. She'll land him live, although the indices have turned against survival. She'll verify his status. Joke. This mercy flight's a takeout delivery. He's cold to the elbows and knees. So that often is the case, that one is practicing medicine and practicing very good medicine under difficult, at best, difficult situations. And sometimes the policies behind the decisions of commanders demand that a medical person do things that they feel violates the Hippocratic Oath. It's a horrible situation to be in. So here she is again on her last flight out from Balad Air Force Base to return to the U.S., but the plane is sitting on the runway. It's not taking off. This damage check delay beyond her control. Her crew held on board. That too. And the stack of crates whose joints are stained a tarry black. The downshift of scent to stench as the hold heats up. Ground time stretched past noon. The porthole pelted by sand and wind. A maniac beat like death metal drumming. Perfect Iraq send-off for her exit. How will her soul convalesce from this tour of racket and ruin? She is alive, but festering, rot in her cells, like these boxed remains, ID packet taped to each lumpy shroud. She's zeroed out, too close to nothing to even feel alone, flat as a JPEG, grade to monotone. So I think I would like to read one more poem from the section on PTSD, a poem that's quite different in tone from many of the other ones in the book. It uses metaphor and description to try to get inside the feeling of that gap you feel when on one hand, you're in chaos from a flashback, and on the other hand, you're in a quote unquote normal situation, but you're between them and you have no ground to stand on. In late summer, the sea comes to the city. It isn't yourself you see at the end of August. You are a reflection in a gutter's standing water, and the flat you, swept up in traffic, is an image looking back. The rush of drive time, like the rush of surf, just another noise fastened to the brain. The faster the speed, ambulance, squad car, the more headway into a boredom repetitious as sun that blunts and stuns, until all seagulls look the same. Generics. The oddness of it being hollowed by not being able to notice detail. Imagine, what is it like to be left with a solitary thought, uprooted, pulled out from beneath you by unfathomed undertow? Every last cell lost. In this way, you learn distance from your memory. So that's a little bit about me as a child, about the experience of Americans serving in the war and coming home. But the first section addresses the people who are living in the war zone. It's their country, and they're being shelled. So I'll start with a poem that's pretty much verbatim from my friend Fadwa, who was born in Lebanon, not Pennsylvania, Lebanon, and has many relatives in the Middle East. And I want to thank Fadwa very much for letting me use her voice in this book. It's war, Fadwa says. A cousin moved to Baghdad from Tehran. Gone. Her children, gone. Or all of them missing, which may not mean gone, but just beyond reach, which may mean alive. Or not. It's war, Fadwa says, and there's no fog in her sorrow and clarity. 10 years, she says, no word, wishing no one dead, even if they are.
You know, I wanted to say with that poem, the format you have used for it really does lend itself to, you know, to what you're saying here. And I mean the use of, you know, gone, gone a number of times, and the other things, gone, gone, missing, alive, it's war. I mean, all these down the right hand part of the poem
Right.
work very effectively. Yeah, yeah. So, is why did you settle on that? I think it's a great use of that form.
Well, it was not written that way.
Mhm.
And someone said to me, Peter Murphy said to me that the way it was written sort of flattened what it was saying.
Mm.
And so I made some changes, but I have to say it took me over a year to thinking about it and fooling with it to find something that really felt right, that visually, because there's this gap,
Yeah.
that visual showed these two realities.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's a great example of how form can really say what you want to say. Sometimes, you know, form is really like a kind of a straitjacket, and your poems, not yours, but one's poems
Yeah.
move so fast that people really don't have a time to digest it. But this poem, you really have that opportunity. So kudos for you deciding to use that form for this poem. And I would
Thank
say
you.
for other poems as well.
Thank you. There are a lot of formal concerns in the poems, and I break form.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the sonnet sequence is sonnet because I was so disturbed and what's the word? Distracted, really, by the horror of the details I was reading about women's lives on military base. And it wasn't all horrible, but it was a very hard, they were difficult to stomach. That I felt that rather than get wrapped up in my own concern and my own fear for women living in those situations, and there are thousands,
Mm-hmm.
I would have to have a form that was so hard for me to accomplish that I would be concentrating on the form, and then the poem would sort of emerge from my struggle with the form, and it really worked.
It's like, you know, when you read that section, it is almost like I know you're probably not calling it almost like a crown sonnet. In a sense,
Yeah,
there is a, you know, they're just not individual sonnets. There is a continuity from one to the
right,
next, and how it picks up that way. And
right.
I know you want to say, well, that was not maybe intentional, but from my side, it really does remind me of a crown sonnet.
Uh-huh. I think it was intentional. The last
Mhm.
line is picked up in a
Exactly.
fragmented way by
Uh-huh.
the first line of the next one, but
Mhm.
it's not a royal crown, because a royal crown would have 15 sonnets.
Mhm.
Mine only has 10. And the last sonnet would be made up of the first lines of all the other sonnets.
Mhm.
But I didn't do that.
Okay. It's all right.
Well, yeah, right. So maybe what I do now is move to a poem about a poem that takes place in Damascus. Let's see what time we're at. Oh, okay. I think I can read this. It's called Dark of the Moon. And for those of you who don't know, the Muslim feast of Ramadan begins as the crescent of the new moon is first seen. And so Ramadan begins at a different moment in each location, depending upon the rising of the moon. So this would be the night before Ramadan. And there are stringers in this. Those are freelance journalists who are looking for stories, coming in on spec, trying to find a story. Rumi is in it, a poet who lived in Damascus for a short time in the 12th century. And let's see, there's something. Oh, and there are names of places in Syrian and names of food in Syrian. So when you hear an odd word, it's one of those. Dark of the Moon. In Rif Damashq, the suburbs of Damascus, in Yarba, in Doma, in Daraya, Arbin, where parents caution, try not to die today. Here, the jeeps and troops sweep districts, flood the courtyard walls with wind and windows with sniper shots. Take the rooftops that Rumi praised. Go up to the roof and sing. Sing loud. In the dark of the moon, the suburbs sleep, except the men who congregate behind closed doors, where the coffees and juices flow, sweetened with rumors and deals. When prayers split the dawn, their praises will rise over a scattering of corpses, not the heaps of 2012, the bled out limbs and torsos blocking boulevards and alleys, or the next years frozen in cars, in bazaars, not a speck of blood, gassed to perfect death. Who says Damascus has regained its normal? Foreign stringers who fly in to write of heaps of dates and trays of fried collage that scent the midday markets as the city readies for the fast and feast of Ramadan. Their hired local drivers travel resurfaced roads, won't take the turns into the suburbs where shipments of wheat and medicines are seized. Here, crouched under searchlights and starlight, citizens pluck seed heads from spring grasses, strip leaf buds from trees. No dates, no sweet desserts for famine's holy feast. Well, maybe a place to move is into the war that I was born into. And that's the Second World War, though again, not in Europe. Nonetheless, that war has stayed with me, and I've read a great deal about it. And a number of years ago, I worked as a poet in the schools, which means I went into this school or that school and did a week of poetry with students, or 2 days or 1 day. At this time, New Jersey had in its curriculum study of the Holocaust. And this poem is based on an experience I had in a school in New Jersey working with 6th graders. It's headed up by a quote from the Peruvian poet Cesar Vallejo. And this is a translation. What escapes into you? Don't hide it. Reading with students about death camps. The evidence, their eyes filling with it. Mine too. Memories Charr curling the edges of pages, photographs, maps. The sear of witness, real as innards twisting open, the tropes of bread crusts, catalogued shoes, barrels of gold from teeth. Not our lives, but lives of the dead, escaped into us. Grave, we open to them. And I think really that's how we citizens back from war, I don't mean back, but I mean standing outside of war, who have never stood inside war. That's how we can bear true witness, not phony witness, but authentic witness to what we see. And it could be the wars in our own neighborhood, the wars in our own city, all the undeclared wars against the poor, people of color, women. It's a long list, children. So there is a way that we can witness authentically and write if we want what we witness. I guess, do I have time for one more?
Absolutely. You have plenty of time.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you one question about one of the poems. It's titled Debriding was the title, but it's Debridement. Can you explain to our readers? Because I think when I really think of what I know about that process, it's a process of healing, but you're not completely healed. You can probably explain it better than I can. But I really felt that this book was in many ways about that, that process.
It's so interesting you say that, Charles, because a number of people, many of them over 50, and that may have something to do with it, have said to me they read this book and they wept, but when they put it down, they felt something released inside themselves that they've been carrying. And I do feel that was the case for me in writing it. So I'll read the poem. It's short.
Sure.
Maybe I'll read it and then I'll say what debridement is. Okay. So it's called Debriding. And there's a Bacchante in it. So a Bacchante is a devotee, a woman who worships the god of wine, Bacchus, and is usually has moments of wild abandon. In Greek, often involving sex and also death. Debriding. A backyard Bacchante. The night howl in your ears, your memory a carnivore ravening the entrails of castaway reason. My friend, you've survived, but your will not release the scream. Your wound will not heal in the mind that daily eats it raw.
Wow. And debridement, can you explain that a little in layman's language to our...
A little. If you're severely burned, a chemical burn or a fire burn, in order for your skin to heal, it has to be raked open frequently. And that's incredibly painful. So I hear. I've not experienced this. And in a hospital, a nurse usually will debride a patient. And often the same nurse will debride the same patient. So they have a relationship, which seems extraordinary because the nurse is causing the patient incredible pain. But that is the only way the patient's skin will regenerate. Mm-hmm. Of course, there are other ways to regenerate skin, but sometimes it has to be debridement. Until about, I don't know, maybe 30 years ago, that was really the primary way.
All right. Well, we're just about at time, but I wanted to close by, of course, thanking you. And thank you for this book of poems. It's really a lovely book of poems. And as I say, there's a necessity to these poems. Really, it's necessary that people read them. And I just wanted to say we had a discussion before the broadcast last week about how we can continue this um, presentation of the life of women who are vets and women who are vets who write poetry as well. And so I had said to you that, usually in November, I do a special show in honor of Veterans Day. And so in November, I would hope that maybe we can put something together that honors the poetry of women vets and women vets. So I would really like to work on that with you. We have plenty of time to do it. I think it would be a really remarkable.
I would really, really like to do that.
Yeah, yeah.
They are an unheard people.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So again, thank you, JC, for being
Thank
my
you.
guest or being our guest, and thank you to Ileana, with her beautiful name, of being our technical director here at Philly Cam. And thank you to Philly Cam to continue to make this broadcast happen. As I say at the end of every program, realize that Philly Loves Poetry is just one program of all the things that Moonstone Arts does for the promotion and the love of poetry in the city of Philadelphia. Consider that we have 100 readings in a year that represent or give an opportunity to close to 300 poets to bring their work to Philadelphia and to the public. And I say to you is that we need support to continue to do this. So I ask you to do that support Larry and the things that he's doing almost as a one-man show. I know there are other hosts of readings, upcoming, but Larry has put so much energy into this. So I ask you to go to our website, moonstoneartscenter.org, and see in a way that you can provide support for the ongoing mission of Moonstone Art, which is the promotion of the love of poetry, and it has been for close to 30 years. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and I hope to see you again, next month. And again, thank you to our special guest, JC.
Thank you, Larry.